Cool. So I'm Tim Merel from Digi-Capital. We're an AR/VR advisor, so industry reports, strategy consulting, and M&A, so investment banking. I'm a software engineer, investment banker, and lawyer, so I get into trouble in lots of different ways. If you want to find out any more, just reach out afterwards. Now, we're going to talk about mobile AR specifically and how it could push the market over 1 billion users and 60 billion revenue in 5 years' time. Basically, the platform war has begun. Pokemon Go got everything started last year in terms of the perception as to where the market was going. But that was really probably the most basic form of mobile AR you can think of. The most important thing about that, beyond just what it did last year, was the influence it had on various big tech players' strategies. And in terms of where the market is now, where it's going, it's the entry of Apple and Facebook that's changed everything. Tim Cook's been enthusiastic about AR for a while and been very public about it, and when he broke cover a few weeks ago, it really kicked off the war in earnest. But that was presaged by Mark Zuckerberg coming out and talking about their camera effects platform. And these two guys will end up dominating the mobile AR space, and Apple in particular has potential to dominate all of AR going forward. And now here we're talking about phone and tablet AR, not smart glasses. That's where the really scale market is going to be. If you wouldn't mind just clicking on the tablet image, I'll show you something very simple that's come up in the last few weeks. Very simple, you can cancel that out. It's a very simple example of basic functionality. New application, it's actually the second measurement app that I've seen so far. And even this morning, I saw a couple of guys in Japan who'd taken just a cardboard-style VR headset using ARKit, and they had basically like laser tag using ARKit for the tracking, running around in a field. And incredibly simple, very quick, a few weeks after the dev kits starting to go out to developers. And that's the power of mobile AR, particularly when it doesn't require any fancy hardware. So it doesn't require Tango. That demo you saw was on a standard iPhone. And that's a big part of the reason why this is going to be the market going forward. Now, there are two sides to it. There's mobile AR hardware and mobile AR software. The hardware piece, so far, Tango is basically the hardware piece. It's going to be followed, we think, by Apple coming in either later on this year or next year with an iPhone AR, so the iPhone 8 or the iPhone 9. In terms of how that's going to go around installed base, it's around phone replacement cycles. Now, most folks in this room would buy a new phone every 2.5 years. It used to be less. That's a huge headache for the major phone makers. We think that mobile AR hardware, particularly when Apple enters, is going to actually shorten that period. But if you look at phone replacement cycles, we think that you could go from an almost no installed base to tens and hundreds of millions of mobile AR hardware phones in a very short space of time. But the big market and the scale market is going to be the mobile AR software market. And that's going to be driven by the operating system and messaging platforms. So let's start with Facebook. They've got 1.2 billion users for Messenger. Same for WhatsApp. 700 million for Instagram. Now, it's tempting to lump all these together, but Facebook doesn't have over 3 billion active users. It's probably 2 billion or less in total. But when you look at the scale of the platform they're starting from, that's a pretty big base to start from. With Apple themselves, there are around 400 million ARKit compatible devices today. When you look at the sales rate of iPhones and iPads and look at the uptake around iOS 10 going into iOS 11, they're going to get to a very high number of installed base of devices that will have ARKit installed with iOS 11 very quickly. And then you go down to Snapchat, Line, and so on. In China, very different case. With WeChat, with Tencent, they have as exciting an opportunity in China, if not more so, than Facebook has in the West. The bulk of Chinese mobile users open up WeChat 10, 20, 30 times a day. So they've already fought with Alibaba in relation to mobile AR with Hongbao, which is the traditional red envelopes with money inside. We think they're going to be a huge player. Now, when you look at the scale of those platforms, you then start thinking about, okay, well, how quickly will folks start adopting this? And fortunately, there's some good hard data in terms of adoption rates for new features. With WhatsApp status, over 15% in 10 weeks. With Instagram stories, almost 30% in a year. With Snapchat stories, over 45% in 4 years. Instagram Direct, over 50% in 4 years. With WeChat Moments, it's opened by over 60% of WeChat users every time they open the app, 5 years after it was launched. And lastly, if you look at iOS 10, well over 80% of iPhone and iPad users have got it installed today. So take those sorts of adoption rates, and that's what's going to drive the installed base from those very large numbers. So put that together, and this is the sort of picture you get. The light blue line is mobile AR hardware. So with phone replacement cycles, we think it'll go from tens to hundreds of millions and well over 400 million mobile AR phones within 5 years' time. But the big number, the dark blue bar, that's simply applying the scale of those other platforms, the adoption rates, and you get a few hundred million next year and over 1 billion users within 5 years. So if you look at the hard data on what's there, the only numbers that make sense for mobile AR are big numbers. But when it comes to revenue, it's not quite the same story. The reason being that it's going to take the developer ecosystem a while to spin up. So if for the developers in the room, in terms of building a sustainable business around mobile AR, you're probably not going to see huge revenue this year. You'll see an uptick next year, and we think it'll still be well below 10 billion. But going into 2019, when the developer ecosystem has spun up, when you see a whole range of new app types which haven't existed before, that's when we think the market's going to hit an inflection point, and it could hit over 60 billion within 5 years' time. Basically, in terms of AR and VR, this is a scale market, both in terms of users and in terms of revenue. But in terms of that revenue, it may not look like what you expect. It's not all going to be Pokemon Go. A big chunk of it's going to be mobile network data, and we've been spending time talking to the telcos about this. It's a big opportunity for them. It's also a threat for them, because the amount of data you need to actually support mobile AR apps is fairly significant, but they've got to figure out how they can actually have premium pricing to avoid it being a loss leader. In other words, avoid cannibalizing what they're already doing. E-commerce is going to be a huge component of it. It's a big part of the reason why Alibaba was the lead on Magic Leap's round. And again, they're actively pushing into the market and doing experiments. Then into advertising, non-games apps, the enterprise piece is fairly clear. Most tradesmen have got a phone, they may not have smart glasses. So again, look at that simple measuring app as a very basic example. There's a whole range of things you can do with the sort of positioning that you can get with ARKit, and also further down the line with some of the messaging platforms. And then on into games. So it's going to be a fairly broad spread, but more than 80% of it is going to come from non-game sources. So thinking about how you apply your skills, whether in games or elsewhere, there's a lot of opportunity. Lastly, when we're thinking about how is this going to spread regionally? Well, broadly speaking, it's about installed base. And what that means is Asia's going to lead, China in particular, but also Japan and South Korea. In the West, we think it'll be roughly split equally between North America and Western Europe. But basically, it's a big market, there's a lot of potential. So if you've got something which is revolutionary, and now's the time, there's a lot of opportunity globally. Finally, from a competitive standpoint, we think even before the war's actually properly begun, the winners are already pretty clear. In the hardware space, Apple has the ecosystem. They've got hardware, software, app store, developers, retail, they've got everything. And we think they're going to dominate the market in terms of hardware. In other words, if and when Apple comes out with an iPhone AR, it's got the whole piece, and that's going to dominate. Being challenged by Google with Tango, Samsung, Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, and others. What they don't have is that whole ecosystem piece. In other words, no one other player owns the whole lot. In the software space, it's going to be Apple, again, with ARKit, Facebook with the camera effects platform and what else is coming from them, and Tencent in China will be the dominant players because they have natural strengths which will be very hard to beat. They'll be challenged by Snapchat, Alibaba, Baidu, Snow, and others. So it's going to be a huge market, but the guys at the top of the pyramid, the major players, are the ones to watch, the ones to focus on. So if you're a developer, that's where I'd say you should look first. That's basically it. So if we have time, I've got a couple of minutes, so I can take 1 or 2 questions.
Has anyone got any questions?
Yeah, question please. Here at the front. We've got the mic if you...
So when you were talking about Asia, you talked about China, South Korea. You didn't talk about India. Do you have any forecast on the Indian market?
Yeah, we've got India in our forecast. We think India is going to be a very big market in terms of installed base. But as you would know, the Indian market around mobile doesn't monetize as well at scale as, say, the Chinese market today. It's not as big a market yet. In terms of mobile AR, we expect a similar dynamic. In other words, it'll be a big market. It's just a question of scale. So if you're looking at revenue in the mobile market globally today, China is a larger market than India right now in revenue terms, even though installed base, they're both huge countries. So we expect a similar dynamic in mobile AR. And again, the thing to think about is, depending on which market you're in, China is Apple's first or second biggest market, depending on which year you're looking at in terms of phones. So again, ARKit, it's going to be on Apple devices, so there's a bit of a bias in that direction in terms of China. But again, on the Android piece, there's going to be a lot there, so it's going to be a big market.
Okay. And there's one more here.
Where do you see VR relative to AR?
VR is going to be big, AR is going to be bigger. Broadly speaking, we think that AR will be around 3 times the size of VR in revenue terms in 5 years' time. In terms of installed base, we think it's going to be substantially larger because of mobile AR. You know, if you look at VR, it's fantastic, it's immersive, it's wonderful experiences. But that simple demo I showed you before, doing a tape measure, it's on your phone. You don't need to buy a headset, you don't need to buy a PC. And even when you think about comparing, say, mobile AR to smart glasses, again, that market will end up being much larger than all the other markets, but will take time. So in the next 5 years, the mobile AR market is going to dwarf everything else in terms of installed base and in terms of revenue.